Hi, my name is Chris, and I am the Paranormal Preservationist. My background is in historic preservation, and I'm a paranormal researcher. In these episodes, you will hear stories of historic research and the paranormal, and be faced with questions like the one I hope to answer in today's episode. What role do paranormal researchers have in keeping historic narratives alive, and more importantly, factual? Today, the topic of research hits close to home for me. I chose this narrative first because I believe it will help you understand where I come from, and perhaps why I'm here. Sometimes you can't avoid having research impact you personally. For me, that day came when the opportunity came to research a small duplex in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. From the outside, the duplex looked like every other hastily vinyl-sided duplex with overgrown grass and no landscaping. It looked quite empty and quiet. In fact, every research project that I receive starts this way. At least, that is how I feel. An empty place. And my job as a public historian is to bring back the narrative and fill these locations with life through these lost histories. That's the real power of a place, because with it, with that narrative, the community, owners, and visitors can reclaim those lost memories. Anyway, back to the duplex. I'd lied if I didn't already know why I was standing outside this duplex, because for me, the story starts when I was much younger. Because for much of my childhood, and perhaps even some of my early adulthood, I didn't know that my father had another sister, that I had another aunt. Now, of course, losing track of my dad's brothers and sisters would be easy, seeing the oldest was born in 1934 and the youngest, number 13, was born in 1956. But Margaret, Aunt Margaret, who was she? Margaret's life story started with hopes and dreams. Started with a loving family of 12 brothers and sisters and a hard-working father, Alfred, who worked in the textile mills in nearby Fall River to support his family. Margaret would attend Rogers High School in Newport until her junior year. Her friends and family would describe her as a well-liked and respected. She spent her time teaching CCD to children at St. Anthony's Church in Portsmouth. Her passions were writing, poetry, reading the Bible, and teaching. She wrote about love in the armed forces. I even heard a story last week from one of my uncles that when I asked him if he knew Margaret, he went on to tell me how he was very young, but did remember her bringing him to the beach. He always went to the beach, and she was always smiling. And that was Margaret. Her life was full of promise. She loved attending the regularly occurring dances at the Newport Naval Base. They didn't live too far from Newport, so it wasn't that far of a trip, and these dances were held monthly. One such dance was on December 19th, 1954, and Margaret would attend this dance with her sister Carolyn. Attending this dance with her sister was, in fact, what my grandfather, told the local newspaper that he never permitted her to attend a dance unless she was with another sister. The dance, the day, it was full of music and Navy men from the nearby ships and that were stationed outside. Margaret was in love with the Navy and was disgusted on how they were treated by law enforcement. And, in fact, one of her proudest moments was being published by the Herald News almost a year before that dance, in 1954. In it, she writes, "Dear neighbors, I have been following the trouble with the Navy and Fall River Police. I think it's pretty mean. Maybe you people who criticize our sailors and enlisted men need the embarrassment and scandals yourself." Now, she published this not under her name, but anonymously. I was able to find it in the newspaper, and it's important to our story here because she did not like people who branded sailors as no good. At this dance in 1954, Carolyn and Margaret were having a great time. It got late. Carolyn would talk to her sister Margaret about leaving, but Margaret had met two other Navy men, Fred B. Zimmer, who was 25 years old, and Clyde Brumfield, 18 years old. Throughout the evening, Margaret spent much of their time dancing with Zimmer, and one sailor said Zimmer seemed to have had his eyes on her the moment they met. I'm sure by this time Carolyn had also met these two Navy men and must have felt comfortable enough with them to agree to let them bring Margaret home, and they would meet later for coffee that night. Now, this is one of those decisions that changed my family forever. If you're not into sad stories or outcomes that are far from happy, then perhaps leave now with her memory. But this story really starts here. Once Margaret left the dance, Clyde Brunfield was to drive Margaret home, with Fred Zimmer as a passenger. At some point, maybe right away, Fred joined Margaret in the back seat of the 1951 Chevrolet Blue Tudor sedan. The drive from Newport to Portsmouth was about 35 minutes. What happened in those 35 minutes? I'll never know. What did they talk about? What led to Fred thinking he could have his way with my aunt? Why? One can only imagine the shock and fear that Margaret went through as they passed her street with these two monsters. Some point they stop on a side street that no one traveled. My aunt tried to scream. Clyde probably didn't listen. And then she went quiet, strangled by her necklace. Evidence at the scene would show a piece of her clothes and a coat hanger from the car on the ground. It shows me that doors were opened at some point. Could Brumfield have been the one in the back seat, but the older Zimmer felt he should cover for his younger nephew? We'll never know. Once they leave the scene of the murder, Clyde would take off to the Newport Hospital. On their way, police officers tried to stop them and chased them for about 3/4 of a mile. And when they caught up, he was told they were rushing her to the hospital because they had a sick girl in the back seat. When they failed to turn in the direction of the hospital, which always confused me because where were they going? They were stopped again, and upon closer examination of the car, they saw Margaret in the back, sitting with her head resting on Fred Zimmer. He ordered them to rush to the nearest hospital. It was there she was officially announced dead at 1:40 a.m. in the morning, and with her entire time in her purse was the article she wrote about treating the Navy with respect. The article I read before. She held on to it. It was with her. Ironic. It was 1 hour and 40 minutes after she was to meet her sister for coffee. Now you'll see some pictures. One with the sisters right after the event, and one of my grandparents when they found out that night about the horrific events. You can see the devastation. Carolyn, her sister, was asked by a local newspaper about what happened, and she was quoted as saying she met these two sailors. Both of them seemed very nice looking boys. Just before we left, she, Margaret, suggested that we would leave separately, but would meet in a diner for a cup of coffee. I waited for more than an hour and a half for her, and then decided she must have gone along home. Her mother said she's dead because she trusted everybody. That really describes my aunt. And I don't know how my grandparents made it through this and were able to tell the 11 of their children that they just lost a sister. Then having to go to trial and identify their daughter to sit through the trial. Quite a horrific experience for anybody. Margaret was laid to rest 3 days after. She was brutally assaulted in a very simple funeral with friends and family. Zimmer would get a life term, and he pleads no defense to second-degree murder. Now, this story is interesting for me because the tragedy that hit my family is something that should never be forgotten and definitely told. And I think along with many narratives that we discover in the paranormal of these souls that have been lost to horrific events and forgotten about. And I guess that brings me to the question that I posted is what is our job as paranormal investigators? How do we get these stories out, and how do we make sure they're accurate? How do we not add the theater to our stories, our history? For me, this was easy because of the family connection. And though I have mixed emotions because with the money that the Navy gave my family, $2,814.46 to be exact, they were able to buy a new home in Tiverton. And it would be in this home that my father was born. So oddly, because of the murder of my aunt, my father was born, and I'm here with you today. And it's those types of twists and connections in historic narratives that I think complicate things. Now, back to the question. As a paranormal investigator, or as members of the paranormal field, when we come against tragedy, as we walked up to that duplex to investigate, is it our job to come to that with the knowledge of that narrative, that story, and to keep it factual? Because many times I see when we go to investigations, we let the investigation talk for us. We let our feelings and our emotions or our gadgets tell us what is going on in this space. But my aunt's story was real. My aunt's narrative, the facts attached to that story are unchanging because, well, that's what happened. Is it our job to make sure that we preserve that fact and not add the theater, not add the overdone dynamics of what sometimes we do? It's a hard question. When a historian meets a paranormal investigator, a lot of times there's conflict because there's narratives that are developed out of an investigation that don't match the historic narrative. And I guess someone caught in the middle sometimes struggle with what drives what. Does the public historian, does the researcher drive the investigation, or does the investigation drive the research? And for me, with this story, when we approached that duplex to investigate, this story was my focus because this was the narrative I wanted to retold, and I wanted people to know that my aunt was murdered, that she lived here, that my family lived here, that a family lived here, even if it wasn't my family. Regardless of what was caught, regardless of what we wanted to catch, the story, the narrative, that was what I wanted told. So what is our role as a paranormal investigator? Is it to be a public historian? Or is it to simply look for paranormal activity?